Smoke from 1,000 pyres draped Winterfell like morning veils. The air tasted of ash and thawing snow, of fat that had dripped and hissed on the fire, of oiled leather and the iron stink of blood that no washing could quite chase from the stones. Dawn had come pale and indecisive, a smudge behind a scrim of cloud. On the battlements, the snow lay in a thin skin over old soot, crunching softly under Jon's boots as he walked the wall. Ghost padded with him, close for the first time since the fighting, white fur ragged where dead hands had torn and teeth had worried. The direwolf's ruined ear twitched at every creak in the ice, every old groan of timber. Jon reached down at last, fingers sinking past Winter's cold into the warmth at Ghost's neck. The beast leaned, wait and trust, a low sound shivering his chest. "I know," Jon told him, and the wind took the words and scattered them across the godswood. Winterfell breathed around him in the way only a living castle does. The distant beat of hammers from the smithy where new nails were being driven into old wood. The call and answer of voices along the outer yard. The rumble of carts with cracked wheels and patched axles. The dead lay burnt, but the dead were everywhere still. In the empty places where laughter had been, the gaps in a shield wall that had held a moment too long. He could name too many of them if he let himself. Theon Greyjoy, who had died as a Stark. Jorah Mormont, who had died where he would have chosen to die. Lyanna Mormont, fierce cub of a fierce house. Dolorous Ed, who had been less dolorous in dying than he had been in life. There were others he would not name or could not bear to. He turned at the crunch of boots behind him. Davos Seaworth raised a hand against the cold, his fingers darker at the nails where frost had gnawed, his hair a salt tangle under a hood. "Ravens," Davos said without ceremony, his breath a steam between them. "From the south, more than one." Tyrion's hand, and another sealed with a spider. Jon took the parchments, the wax signets broken only because Davos had long since learned when to break rules. Ghost sniffed and huffed without interest. The words were small and quick, a hand practiced at hiding truth in less ink. "Cersei is keeping the gates closed," Tyrion had written. "The streets are overflowing, grain stores dwindling. She's drawn small folk within the walls and posted the Golden Company without. She means to wear them as armor. If there is a place for them, the people will go. If there is a safe road, they will take it. The realm will remember who opened the road." The spider's letter was plainer still, as if the man had bled all art from his quill long ago. "They have begun to fear both queens. Fear makes a mob. A mob burns. If there is mercy anywhere north of the neck, send word that it is there. If there is bread, send word that there is bread. There are children being weighed like sacks of oats on the fish scales of the hook. Do it quietly if you must." Jon read both messages twice before he lowered them. Beyond the wall, a corvid winged past with something bright caught in its beak. A twist of ribbon, a sliver of brass, and vanished on the wind. Davos watched him without impatience. The old smuggler had a way of listening that made even silence feel like counsel. "They'll starve them in the streets," Davos said, "if she does not burn the streets first." "She won't," Jon said on instinct and heard how thin that sounded. He thought of Daenerys standing before the great pyre they had laid outside Winterfell, her face lit from below by flames that devoured men he had loved. She had not wept that he had seen. She had held herself still while the North spoke words to old gods and new, and when the smoke had taken what it wanted, she had gone away alone with her grief. Rhaegal had wheeled overhead, dark wings scorched at the tips. Drogon had not left her shadow. He folded the letters while his hands remembered, feeling the crispness of the paper, the muscle memory of command he had never asked to learn. "We can't feed the North as it is," he said quietly. "Sansa told me the counts. There is gruel and oats if we stretch, salt cod if the Manderleys are generous. Winter will not leave because it has been asked." Davos's mouth turned in something that was not a smile. Winter seldom listens, but the North would not be the first poor country to take in poorer. "I once saw a man with one ear and half a nose share his last onion with a woman who had less. Neither starved. They weren't full either." He shrugged one broad shoulder. "You asked me to speak plain when the time came. It looks to be the time. The people down there are yours as much as ours, by right of the oath you swear to them or the one they would ask of you if they had the courage." Jon let out a breath, the cold stealing it at once. "Call Lord Manderley. All of him, not a steward. Summon the captains with boats that can put to sea. I want to know how many mouths we can carry from the south to White Harbor and how we can hide those boats from men with iron on their sails. Tell the stewards to bring me the store counts again." "And the Lady of Winterfell?" Davos asked, though he plainly knew the answer. "I'll tell Sansa myself." They climbed down from the wall and crossed the yard where men were washing mail with brine and vinegar, where spears were lined in rows like bare winter trees. Jon felt the eyes that followed him, the weight and the warmth and the chill of them. "My lord," some said, "and your grace." Others insisted, and once, stubborn as a nail that had been hammered flat too many times, "My king." He answered each with a nod that acknowledged what they meant and what they would not say. In the great hall, the fires had been banked, the tables cleared of the uneven feast that had been less feast than defiance. Sansa was where he knew she would be, not upon the high seat but standing near the board with ledgers open before her, a quill in her hand and a pinch of ink on her finger that she would not notice until much later. Brienne stood near the door, helm tucked under her arm. As if guarding a queen proved easier when there were two oak planks between the world and her watch. Arya was nowhere, which meant she was everywhere she cared to be. Sansa lifted her head as he approached, as if his footsteps drew a line across the floor, and she felt the chalk of it. Her face had become a mask that fit her in a way the girl he remembered would never have believed. The mask was not a lie. It was a tool. "You've news," she said, before he had opened his mouth. She read letters in the tightness at the edges of his eyes. He gave her the parchments. She read them once through and then a second time, the quill captured between two fingers and held upright as if she might stab the numbers on her ledger through the heart with it. "So," she said when she had finished. "No outrage, no derisión." A plain syllable like a knife laid on a table. "So," Jon echoed, and waited for the ledger to become the room. Sansa closed the covers softly and set the quill down. "If you open our gates, every road that runs north will pour into them. That is a truth. If you open our granaries, we will have fewer stores when the next snows come. That is another. If you do not open them, mothers will make a choice between the child they carry and the one at their side, and they will remember your name. That is the third truth." "What answer do you ask me for, Jon?" "The right one," he said, and her mouth tightened in a way that showed him all the years she had lived that he had not seen. "Then hear the right things. Lord Manderley sent word after the battle that White Harbor storage was spared. The raiders hit the outer docks but missed the warehouses. We have salted fish, we have hard bread, we have kale and carrots in cellars still unspoiled. We do not have enough for a siege. We have enough for a winter if we are careful. The North has learned to be careful, and it has learned to remember who was careful with it." She tapped the spider's letter with one finger. "Varys does nothing that does not serve Varys and the idea of the realm that lives inside him. But the people he is writing about also live, and I have seen too many dead children to pretend they do not." Brienne shifted against her armor as if the words weighed more than steel. "We can house them in the crofts by the west wall," she said, surprising herself first perhaps. "And in the old barracks on the southern bailey. There's room in the grain sheds if the wagons are shifted. The wells can be dredged. That will be needed if many come." Sansa nodded. "The kitchens can set gruel 3 times a day instead of 2. The gruel will be thinner. We will stretch it with barley. I'll have the weavers cut new blankets from the stores. Winterfell has too many quilts for a castle that always expected less. The gods' wood will be kept clear. They will want somewhere to pray. Some of them to the 7, some to the red god, a few to mothers and fathers carved in old wood. They will go to the tree anyway to ask whatever god is left to listen. Arya will say we should teach them quickly where the shadows in the yard fall earliest." "You've decided," Jon said softly. Sansa's eyes met his. They were the color of the lake in deep freeze, blue not because of sky but because the water itself remembered the cold. "You decided when you came down those steps, and you know it. You are not wrong. But do not mistake a heart for a plan. We will do this, and we will do it properly or not at all. If Lord Manderley is called, it will be with every ship he can float. We will open White Harbor first because the sea carries more than roads will bear, and because sailors have learned how to keep secrets that landmen never do. We will send word along the King's Road that there is bread in the north and mercy with it. We will also send riders into the Wolfswood to hunt. Not deer, the herds are thin. Boar where we can and hare where we cannot. Every mouth will be counted and every loaf. And I will know, John, I will know, if someone lies to me about a single scoop of oats. I wouldn't. I wasn't speaking of you. He could not help the smile that crept there at the corner of his mouth. A quick thing that was gone again before it could soften too much. Davos is already moving. He'll speak to Manderley. I'll ride to White Harbor with him. We'll see the loadings ourselves. And Daenerys? Sansa asked, looking at him until he understood that what she meant was, and the queen who burns? And the queen who holds your truth like a lit brand and cannot decide if she wants to warm her hands on it or press it to her own skin. I will send word, he said. Tyrion wrote, he will have her ear. Her ear has not always held what was best, Sansa said. Too fair to be rancor, too steady to be flattery. Mind your own. She hesitated, then added, John, watch the men when you tell them. Some of them will be angry, and anger needs a face. Make sure it is yours and not the mothers and children you are bringing. He knew what she asked and what it would cost. He nodded. When he left the hall, Arya fell into step beside him without being expected, as if she had been listening from a shadow and had decided the shadow could walk for a little while. You're going south then, she said, to White Harbor, not farther. The south is farther, she said, and smiled a fierce, small smile that had nothing of girlishness in it. I'm going to King's Landing. I'd ask you not to. She tilted her head, dark hair unbound and unadorned, a winter bird that had chosen not to freeze. You can ask, she said. The Hound is leaving in an hour. He says he has a score to settle. I have my own. I'll be faster without a guard. Tell Sansa I'll be careful. She'll know it's a lie. He could have told her of Varys's letter, of Tyrion's plea, of the way small folk can be crushed between the heel and the ground and become part of neither. He could have told her of a city he barely remembered, where his father had left and had not returned. He could have told her too many things. Instead, he reached and took her hand, his gloved fingers closing briefly around hers. Come back, he said. I always do, Arya answered, which was not true and sounded like a prayer. They left by noon, Davos and Jon with a dozen men and a cart that had seen too many roads, the Stark banner and the direwolf snapping once in the wind before the flag-bearer thought better of it and wrapped the cloth close to hide its color. The fields beyond the walls were a patchwork of trampled snow and earth churned to mud by too many boots. Crows watched them go from the bent branches of a leafless copse, black eyes bright with an interest that was not wholly bird-like. White Harbor rose from the sea with the solidity of a promise kept. Its walls were pale where Winterfells were dark, and its harbor had the smell of salt and fish and old rope instead of soot. The Manderley mermen flew from poles that had braved more gales than many houses had kings. Lord Manderley himself came to the hall on a litter with carved arms shaped like leaping dolphins, his great body propped and swaddled, his eyes like small pearls in a face that had once been merry and was now merely kind. The North calls, he said when Davos and Jon had been shown through. He tasted each word like a man tasting broth for a guest. It is not often White Harbor has more bread than Winterfell. We shall find it a strange pleasure to share what we have. The old lord's laughter was warm and short-lived as a candle's gutter in draught. Tell me what you need and how soon you needed it yesterday. Davos leaned over the table with the harbor chart spread beneath his hands, the inked lines of shoals and channels as known to him as the scars on his own sea-battered fingers. You'll want 36 cogs at least, and smaller boats to nose where the larger can't. No flags, no lights. Sail by moon and cloud and the smell of land when it comes. There are coves along the crownlands where a man can hide an ark if he puts his mind to it. We'll stage from Duskendale on the first run and go closer when the sailors find their courage. When the Ironborn smell us, they'll set nets across Blackwater Bay. So we don't give them the smell. We run the outer sea. Your best pilots can set their courses by a wind that hasn't yet begun. You know the men I mean, and the people we collect? Lord Manderley asked, a courteous man even in war. Where do we put them when the boats are full? In the bellies of your ships, Davos said bluntly, and then in the bellies of your storehouses. Jon Snow would rather turn his halls into half-barns than leave them out in the weather. Won't you, lad? Jon nodded. The crofts between the walls and the outer keep, the old barracks, and 1,000 bedrolls on the great hall floor if we need it. The godswood will take some too, if the tree doesn't mind. The tree always minds, Manderley said, too polite to be disagreeable, and always forgives. He sank back against his cushions with a sigh, as if the weight of his willingness pressed him into the litter. I have a daughter who will curse me for emptying the warehouses of fish. I will enjoy that curse, as I have enjoyed each of hers since she learned to speak. Very well, I will send out the ships, and if I see an iron sail, I will see to it that the iron sinks. His small eyes gleamed. White Harbor remembers, but it also learns. They set the first ships out at dusk, sails reefed low, a ghost fleet that made no more sound than the swans at the quay. Men and women moved along the docks like shadows wearing boots, carrying sacks that would be emptied to fill again. Davos walked among them, the old rhythm returning to him, the call and response of rope and hull and tide. Off, he said, and mind your lines, and no lanterns for the mother's sake. And the sailors nodded because they knew him or knew of him or knew a captain when they heard one. Jon stood at the end of the longest pier and watched as the first of the boats slid out into a sea that had taken more men than any war. The cold came at him wet from the water and dry from the air, and somewhere beneath both was a strangeness he could not name until he recognized it for what it was. Hope, raw as a new wound. At King's Landing, hope curled itself small and mean in the corners where the light never reached. The gates had been closed for weeks. The Mud Gate, the King's Gate, the Lion Gate. They stood shut and guarded, and no man who wore a red and gold cloak or a white one thought to ask whether he guarded the city or the Queen inside it. Outside the walls, the Golden Company drilled in perfect lines, elephants stamping and tossing their heads until the wrinkled leather of their ears cracked with a sound like brittle parchment. Inside, the air was thick with want. A little girl named Elsie tried not to picture her mother's hands before the skin had peeled and cracked from cold and work, tried not to miss the ring that had been sold for a heel of bread last week. She knew the taste of bone water and the weaker version of it that came when you had no bone. She knew the sound of the bells when they tolled for plague and for fire and for the day when a king had been born. She did not know what they would sound like when they rang for surrender, because she had not yet learned that bells could ring for that. She carried the last crust of their bread wrapped in a kerchief that had once been a sleeve, and her brother Will walked close, one hand on her elbow as if yet another hand could keep a little sister from being jostled to the ground and stepped on by a man looking for his own sister. Varys found them, or rather, one of his little birds found them, and his eyes were the child's eyes when he looked upon them. There's bread north, the bird said, soft and quick, never stopping lest the wrong ear hear. Go down to the fish market after dark and look for a man with onions sewn on his collar. If he says the word storm, you say smile. Don't go if you're followed. Keep to the alleys. Wrap your feet. Elsie did not ask why she should wrap her feet. She had learned some kinds of questions were stones tied around your neck. She nodded and the bird nodded, and then both were gone because both understood that things survived in the city by leaving no trace. Varys climbed the servant's stairs to his solar and sealed another letter. He did not let his hand shake. He did not think of how a dragon's shadow looks when it passes over the sun. He thought of the smell of hot dust in a summer courtyard and of a boy who had once laughed at a joke he would later regret. He blew the sand from the ink and added the letter to the stack, each addressed to a lord who might listen and to a lord who would not. He sent a girl named Martha to the kitchens again and watched the child's small back as if watching could make a difference. It did not. On Dragonstone, Daenerys stood beside an empty place where Missandei used to sit and tried to swallow food she could not taste. The walls of the old Valyrian stronghold drank the sound of the sea and the wind and gave it back in the long moan of a conch far away, a sound that seemed to come from before men and would go on after them. Grey Worm ate mechanically, his gaze 1,000 leagues from the table, his hands moving with the same precision that had once made them terrible. He had set down Missandei's collar where Daenerys could see it. It lay like a question neither of them could answer. Tyrion hovered at the edge of her presence like a man who had forgotten the customs of a court and had no time to relearn them. Ash. He had never been good at silence. He had learned to be polite with his tongue and impolitic with his truths. "Your Grace," he said carefully, "the North is opening its gates. They'll take in those who flee King's Landing." "And what do they flee?" Daenerys asked without looking at him. Her voice had become a thing of itself, a tone that did not break. "Fear," Tyrion said honestly for once, "and hunger. Cersei is starving them." "Cersei has always starved someone," Daenerys said. "It is one of the few arts she practices well." She turned then, and her hair, unbraided since Missandei's hands no longer moved through it each night, fell heavy over her shoulder. The dragon fire that had lit her in Winterfell had guttered to coals, not gone, banked in a chamber that had little air. "Jon opened his gates?" she asked, and the name curved in her mouth not bitterly, not sweetly either, like a taste she could not decide to spit or swallow. "He did," Tyrion said. He failed to keep hope from his tone. "It may save lives. It may also save you." She lifted her chin. "Save me from what, Lord Tyrion?" "From yourself," he said, because he had drunk enough not to lie and sobered enough to be brave. He bowed his head to cover what his eyes might show. Daenerys' fingers moved to the dragonbone hilt at her hip, a gesture as unconscious as drawing breath. She left it there, a hand on something that remembered her when men did not. "Tell me instead what it costs," she said finally. "Tell me what his mercy buys him." "You know that answer," Tyrion said softly. "Love, allegiance." He hesitated and then told the truth he had hoped he might never have to say aloud. "It buys him the story the realm will tell about him when they are warm and fed. They will say he kept them alive. And what will they say of me?" The question was not a plea. It was a measure. "That you won the war," Tyrion said. "If you let them live to say anything." She turned from him. The sea spoke again through the old stones. "Missandei told me a word," Daenerys said, as if she were speaking to herself. She said it at the end. "A word that means free the world of chains. It does not mean forgive, but it also does not mean burn everything to keep a throne warm." Her mouth tightened. "Go. I will have no more counsel tonight. Leave me to my grief and to my dragon." Rhaegal died the following morning under a sky that had been washed clean by a night rain. He fell into the sea like a mountain, learning it was a mountain too late, and the bloody mist of him blew back into Daenerys' face and hair and mouth. Drogon screamed a sound so old the sea buckled beneath it. The Iron Fleet scorpions spat as if they had old grudges to settle and found them at last, their bolts shuddering through air and scale and killing a portion of something priceless. Daenerys' grief became a blade then. Not rage, not yet, but a sharpened hardness that took the shape of a plan. At White Harbor, the first boats slipped back into port with people crammed so close upon their decks that their elbows had learned new bones. Elsie came among them, her brother's hand still on her elbow, her feet wrapped in rags that had held out the cold and most of the splinters. The man with onions sewn on his collar had put them near the mast and told them to close their eyes when water came over the bow. She had closed them and seen nothing but her mother's hands, whole again and warm. Men shouted and ropes were thrown and caught and tied off. Jon waded into the shallows because the gangplank had stuck and because sometimes there was nothing for a lord to do but make himself useful. Cold went up his legs like a punishment. He took a child and then another and handed them down to Davos and to a woman from the kitchens whose apron still smelled of leek. Elsie reached him last. She had put the last of her bread in her brother's mouth 2 nights ago and watched him chew and pretend to swallow, and then, when he thought she wasn't looking, wedge it in the cuff of his sleeve to save it for her. Jon lifted her, and he thought of a girl in a crypt with a feather in her hand who had turned and not known him and known him anyway. Where? Elsie asked, surprising herself with the sound of her own voice in a place that was not a city. It was a question without shape. Where do I stand? Where do we lie down? Where do we go when hope wakes and finds itself strange? Winterfell, Jon said, not sure who he answered. North. She nodded because the word had begun to move around King's Landing like a rumor with sound legs. North meant bread and blankets and a woman with auburn hair whose face could turn to stone when she needed it to. North meant a man whose name had been sung with old songs and a beast with white fur big as a horse. They moved them by the cartload and by the wagon load and by small troops of children who walked behind women in crimson shawls and under the watch of old men who had put down knives and picked up staves to look official. Winterfell's yard had never held so many voices. They rose and fell in patches. The music of 100 places made one. Sansa stood upon the steps with a parchment in her hand that had nothing written on it because she already knew what it must say. She pointed, and the stewards took the families to the crofts beneath the west wall, to the rows of pallet beds in the old barracks, to the kitchen hearth before the soup pot where steam curled like mercy returned. A southern boy made a face at a northern boy and learned a new word with an O in it that held both insult and admiration. A woman from Rosby showed a girl from Barrowton how to bind a child to her back with a strip of cloth and a knot that would not slip. Brienne walked the outer yard with Podrick at her side. The young man, no longer a boy, his eyes gentle though the rest of him had found its steel. She organized the watch without having to be told to, set new posts along the low wall where a climb would be easiest, placed buckets under eaves that would catch snowmelt for washing. Stay good, she told the yard, as if goodness were a thing that could be ordered like a line of spears. It could not, but the words steadied something nonetheless. There were fights. A man from the Street of Silk cursed a man from the Shivering Forest for taking more than his share of gruel, and the gruel was thin enough to not bear insult. It was ended by a woman with flour on her hands and a cleaver that had cut meat that morning and would cut none now. You'll both eat, she told them, and you'll both you'll both do what nature asks decently, and you won't make trouble unless you fancy trouble back. The men stared at the cleaver and found caution. There were kindnesses that outnumbered the quarrels 10-1. A boy carved a whistle out of a length of cedar and gave it to Elsie's brother, who had never had a whistle and did not know what to do with it except blow until the pure high sound lifted the hair along Ghost's spine and made him huff a reproach. Sansa had the kitchen send broth with an onion quartered into each bowl and did not count the onions until later that night when she could do it without a pen. It was not long before word returned from the south that the exodus had not gone unnoticed. Cersei had tightened the city like a hand making a fist. She had posted men along the river and at the quays where even gulls could not linger without a feather tax. But the sea is a patient tutor, and Davos had learned his lessons long ago. The second run went farther down the Duskendale shore and slid through shallows that would have grounded honest captains. The third went under a moon thin as a coin and took on 100 more than it had the right to carry. Once, a scorpion bolt stitched the night between two boats and took a child with it into the dark, and there was wailing that could not be library quieted. They mourned her and went back and brought the next load too. Tyrion's letters slowed and changed. They had been the letters of a man who believed he could rearrange the world if he found the right sentence. They became the letters of a man who had realized the world had a will too. Varys's letters stopped altogether. Daenerys burned him. A messenger brought to Winterfell in a voice awed and afraid. For treason. For letters. For... The boy could not find the end of that preposition. He had not learned how the words of men end. Jon took the news quietly. He went to the Godswood and stood before the heart tree as a man might stand before a judge who had already given sentence centuries earlier and would not change it. The red leaves barely stirred though the wind had freshened. The carved face looked down with the same open sorrow it had always worn. He did what he thought was right, Jon said, and heard the chisel in the wood agree. Bran found him there though Jon had not sent for him. The boy, no, not a boy, something older that had borrowed the shape of a Stark. rolled his chair over the roots as if the tree moved a little to keep the wheels from catching. "Here," Bran said. "I know," Jon replied. He didn't, not the way Bran did, but he knew enough. "Will she burn the city?" "Fire wants what it is," Bran said calmly. "So do people. What you give them is how you change it. Or you don't." Jon thought of Rhaegal falling from the sky and of Daenerys turning to him in the blowback spatter of her dragon's blood. He thought of the way she had stepped back when he had stepped forward to kiss her, and of the way that step had become a chasm she stood on one side of and he on the other. "I can't close that," he said. "Not for her." "No," Bran agreed. "You can open other things." So Jon opened more gates. He wrote to small keeps and lesser houses whose halls were long and half-empty, and told them to take in 2 families each. He wrote to men who had sent him insults with their refusal to ride and told them he would not remember the insult if they took in children. He wrote to those who had sworn to the Boltons once and told them he would accept penance in the form of bread. Sansa wrote too, with words that reminded men of oaths and debt and the winter that would not forget who had done what when the first snow fell. Some of the replies were grudging. The bread tasted as well. When the time came to go south in war instead of rescue, Winterfell watched Jon stand beneath the arch and close his cloak with the same pin his father had once used. He had Ghost at his side and Davos behind him, and a piece of Sansa's carefulness folded into his saddlebag in the form of lists he would read at night and not lose. He left the refugees with the Lady of Winterfell and with good wool, and with men whose spears knew to point outward in defense of everyone within the walls, not just those born there. He left a piece of himself too, something he did not know how to name and would not want back in the same shape if he could. The snow fell thin and glittering around him as he rode. The armies met the city on a day prettied by sun. That felt wrong. Jon had seen enough killing to know it belonged to weather that made men's hands clumsy and their throats hurt. This blue sky felt like an insult no one had meant. The Golden Company arrayed inside the walls like a chessboard waiting for someone clever to move the first piece, their elephants stamping impatient patterns in the dirt. The Lannister archers stood upon the battlements with their quivers full and their hearts hollow. The people, those who had not escaped to the north or hidden in cellars too deep for daylight, massed in the square like water trying to make itself smaller. Tyrion found Jon before the horns. He looked changed, less by time than by the failure of time to do what he had wanted it to. He had not slept, that much was plain. "If the bells ring," he said without greeting, "hold your men. It will be hard. They'll be blood-hot, and blood cools slowly. But hold them, look at them, make them look at you. And if you can look at her..." His voice changed, footsteps careful now as he stepped into a thought that had been forbidden and now perhaps not. "If you can look at her, do. She will be staring at the Red Keep. She will be hearing what she has lost. She will be tasting fear she will not admit. If the city yields, make her see it." Jon nodded. "Your sister sent me a horse," Tyrion added in a different tone, as if to remind them both of the web that bound they two and Sansa and the North and 1,000 other things. "It's sturdy. It bites. She sends better horses to men she likes," Jon said before he could think not to. Tyrion smiled and went away to work on his betrayal of his sister a second time, which was how a man keeps his promises sometimes. It began simply because most complicated things do. Grey Worm led the Unsullied forward in their perfect squares, the shock of their spears a sound that could break glass. Jon took the northern men in a slower tide, knowing the earth under their boots and the shape of the fear that moved through their bellies, knowing when to let them shout and when to quiet them with his own silent presence. Drogon came like a storm that had remembered it was made of fire. The Iron Fleet died in its bay as if the sea had decided to swallow iron the way it had swallowed so many better things. The scorpions that had killed his brother dragon turned too slowly or not at all. Cersei's cleverness died as many clevernesses do, outwitted by something more brutal and more simple. The Golden Company broke. Elephants screamed, the sound terrible in its brightness, as the ground beneath them turned to mud from men's fierce sweat and piss. The gates shook, then shattered, not with the old wild magic Jon's stories had always promised would take such walls, but with new fire aimed in old hatred. The bells did not ring at once because men held the ropes and men loved their lives and also their queen in complicated ratio. They rang when an old graybeard with fingers stiff from grain counts and seal wax elbowed a boy aside and took the rope and set his weight to it and felt his shoulders pull in the old way and heard the sound he had been a boy to hear once when the city had fallen to a man with his sister on his arm and a crown in his hand. They rang like reprieve. They rang like surrender. They rang like the sound the sea makes when it takes a breath. Jon felt the tremor run through his men, saw a spear lift that should have lowered, saw Grey Worm's jaw harden as if obedience and rage ate the same bread inside him. He put himself in his soldier's way. He lifted his hand and then lowered it and then lifted it again deliberately, making them watch. "Hold," he said plainly, so that no one could pretend not to hear. He found faces and gave them his own to hold, because Sansa had told him that anger needs a face and it should be his. He felt the charge inside the men bleed off into 100 sighs and curses and the disbelief of those who wanted to swing a sword because lifting it had been a relief. He looked up then because Tyrion had asked him to. Daenerys sat upon Drogon's back with the wind in her hair and the bells in her eyes. The dragon's muscles bunched beneath her like the sea under a gale. She was looking at the Red Keep. No, she was looking through it at something only she could see. At a girl sold at a brother's hands, at a crown that had been hammered into shape with the hammerhead facing inward. Jon made himself see her as she had been to him, the woman who had saved him on a frozen lake when winter had tried to unmake manhood itself, the queen who had taken his fealty and given him hers until it came to this. She turned her head. Across the space between them, across the river of histories and injuries, her eyes found his. They were not pleading. They were not forgiving. They were asking a question, one so simple it made him ache. He shook his head, once. Not to deny her, not to defy her, not to order a queen, but to answer that question. Not this. Not like this. Drogon's chest swelled. Jon had felt the heat of that breath on his face once and thought he had died and gone somewhere strangers would never come. The dragon's mouth opened and the fire that lived in the old places uncurled upon the Red Keep like a ribbon of sun. It struck stone that had seen dragons before and decided to break differently this time, not to explode outward into the houses and lanes below but to shear inward, towers falling toward their heart. The great map room split like an egg. Cersei Lannister stood beneath a vaulted ceiling that had juxtaposed constellations and conquest and watched it come down like honest judgment. Jaime reached her in time to take her hand. They died not quick and not slow, an end without witnesses except the death which witnesses all. In the streets, the Lannister soldiers threw down their swords with the same hands they had once lifted cups. Grey Worm saw them drop steel and could not set down the thing that held his spine straight. Missandei had said a word and then she had fallen, and he had not gone with her. He advanced 3 steps and then stopped because Jon had put himself where men do not put themselves if they want to live. "It is over," Jon told him. "We hold. We do not butcher surrender." Grey Worm's eyes were desert dry. "They butchered without surrender," he said, his voice a husk. 1,000 years of slavery stood in his throat. "They will butcher again if they are allowed to stand." Jon did not flinch. You could not argue with a truth like that. You could only answer another truth next to it. "Not today." Grey Worm looked past him to his queen. Daenerys did not look back. She was burning the symbol, not the people, atop the hill that had decided so many lives. He had told himself he would obey, and now she had made it possible. He set his spear but on the cobbles and let it be still. He would kill again, there was no point in lying about that. It would not be today. Someone behind him let out a shudder that became breath. Arya and the Hound reached the torn doors of the Red Keep and passed inside because walls cannot stop what they are half-built to hold. They moved through corridors that had known more plans than prayers. The Hound's hatred had become a habit so well-made it no longer needed tending. He found the mountain that was not a man on the stair, and the two of them broke each other in a dance that had always been a part of the castle's design, the floor crumbling and the sky showing teeth. Arya stood a moment with her hand on the rail that had become hot beneath her palm, and then turned back because she had learned when to kill and when to walk away. In the courtyard, She saw a mother and a child cower under the shadow of a dragon that did not come and took them by the elbows and walked them out into light that was sudden and soft after too much dark. The mother had a scar through her eyebrow and a boy with a whistle tucked into his belt that he did not blow because he knew this was not the time. If Arya cried later that night, no one saw and no one would have known what name she gave her tears. When the smoke thinned and the light returned to a color she could bear, Daenerys brought Drogon down upon the great square where they had beheaded men and crowned them. The Iron Throne had survived by accident because metals sometimes do. She walked toward it with dust in her hair and dust settling on her shoulders like ash that did not burn. Her boots left prints in a fine layer of the city turned to powder. For a moment, in a trick of the sun through a broken wall, it seemed she had wings. She reached out and did not pick up the crown. She set her palm on the metal instead. Felt very little like tiny. Felt like iron. Tyrion came and stood below the dais because someone had to. He did not strip off his pin and cast it aside. Not yet. Maybe not ever. He looked up at the woman for whom he had risked and lost and risked again. He wanted to tell her a jest. He wanted to weep. "Your Grace," he said, choosing the words that mattered. "The realm will need bread and water more than songs. The granaries are nearly empty. The wells in the lower city are fouled. The sewers." "I know," Daenerys said, and the way she said it made him remember for a moment the girl who had walked out of fire with 3 impossibilities in her arms and thought the hard part had ended. "We will feed them. The North will help." Tyrion breathed as if he had been thrown a rope and grabbed it with a hand that had forgotten how to hold. "They already have," he said. "They took in those who fled by your leave or without it. They did it in your name, if you permit." Daenerys took her hand from the throne. "They did it in his," she said, and there was no use in pretending Tyrion did not know whom she meant. She looked toward the square where Jon stood in the sunlight, one hand set on the haft of his sword, not as a threat but as a lever to hold himself upright. She felt something she had been fighting since the snow at Winterfell had taken too long to melt on her shoulders. A weariness that had nothing to do with flesh. "Send for him," she said. "Tell him to bring bread if he has it. And if he has it, I will say thank you where others can hear." That night the city did not burn. It smoldered in places. The keepsmiths whose hammers had once rung for ornaments found their arms turning to the tools of survival. They pulled beams. They propped walls. They dug. Grey Worm set his men in shifts to guard the wells that could still be made clean. The Dothraki were sent to the edges of the Kingswood to hunt, and they laughed and went, because the old joy of a chase had waited too long behind their teeth. The bells hung in their towers blackened, their tongues coated with ash. They might ring tomorrow for life. Jon came to the red keep that was less keep than ruin. He climbed cracked steps and walked beneath arches that had learned to bow. He found Daenerys in a room where the wind went through and tore at a tapestry until patience undid the threads. She stood looking out at a city that had nearly been made her enemy and had not. She did not turn at his footfall. He moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth that always lived in her, the furnace that men had tried to bank and failed to name. "Thank you," she said, and the 2 words were everything they were and nothing more. "You spared them," he said. She made a sound that could have been a laugh if it had not also been a sob. "I spared myself," she said. "You spared me more than I spared them. Do you think I do not know what I would be now if I had told Drogon to turn and burn and turn again until the bells were the only thing left standing? I would have sat a throne made of bones and had no one to bring me water." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he saw all of it there without her needing to speak. Her brother's ghost, her child's small bones in the fire of a man she had learned to love, the green of a city she had not known until it was gone from her, the smell of scorch wherever she went. "Missandei told me a word," she said again. "I thought it meant that if the world was free, then I would be free also. I did not think the world would insist on being free of me if I made it afraid." "You are not your father," Jon said, because the realm had a short memory and a long grudge. "You are what you choose. Today," she agreed, and there was a rock in her voice that had not been there before. "And tomorrow. And the day after. And the day after that, if I am given it. They stood in silence then, the kind that is not empty but full. Below them, men and women began to sing. Not many, and not a song John knew. A street tune lifted over rubble by a woman who still had a voice and somebody to sing to. It rose thin and defiant as a reed through mud. Winterfell did not empty. Rather, it learned to be both what it had been and something else. The Southerners had their own prayers in the shadow of the heart tree, and Sansa let them come so long as they did not carve their own gods into the old one. Some cuts do not heal, she told a man from the hill who had asked permission with a nervous joke. He nodded and found a corner of the yard with gentler roots and murmured to his 7, as if they had always been mild as snow in spring. Elsie learned to walk the battlements without slipping. She learned to carry water without spilling. She learned the names of the places the Northerners had already forgotten their own names for. The little notch in the west wall where an Umber's child had once hidden sweetmeats. The place under the east steps where the ice always set earliest. She kept the whistle her brother had been given and did not blow it until the day a wolf came and set his head level with her waist and huffed. Not unfriendly. Ghost had decided she smelled of cinnamon and salt. She put her hand on his head and felt the warmth of him, and she loved him without words. Word came up the King's Road first on the wind, then on men who needed to speak. The city had fallen, but not to fire that leapt indiscriminate from roof to roof. The Queen had burned the keep. The Queen had spared the people. The Queen had thanked the North. The stories multiplied the way stories do, picking up embroidery and losing buttons. They brought back truth somewhere under their coats. Men who had fought at the Trident and men whose only war had been hunger nodded grudgingly, and a little pleased at something they did not want to name. The Northern lords took the news like stones in their pockets. Heavy, real, something to carry until they knew where to set it down. Sansa kept her accounts and counted her loaves and learned new words for the shapes mercy can take. She wrote to Daenerys with the iron courtesy of a woman who will not surrender the thing that is hers and will nevertheless be scrupulous with the thing she is lending. Your Grace, the letter began. Bread and blankets will arrive at the mud gate on the full moon. Return the wagons. The mules are not a gift. Daenerys read the letter and smiled a small smile because she had learned to like women who did not kneel when they could bow. She replied with a thanks as sincere as any she had ever written. She gave Tyrion the credit for the second line. The mules will be returned in better tack than they left, provided Podrick Payne can be persuaded to stop naming them. Politics followed as politics does. Men wanted promises. Women wanted guarantees. The Reach would give grain if the Stormlands gave men to guard the roads. The Riverlands would trade in timber for iron nails and a right to use a port that would not steal their cargo under tired eyes. Far away, the Ironborn thought again about an island's pride and decided pride was easier when the sea was flat and there was less Targaryen fire in it. The question of the North's place came like weather. It seeped through tents and taprooms and finally into the council hall where a map had been peeled off the floor and spread upon a new board. Sansa spoke first with the simplicity of a statement that has been considered from all angles and found to be the same shape from each. The North is free, she said. It will remain friendly. It will remain itself. She did not add that she would have made the same speech to a different queen had the city burned. She did not have to. Daenerys listened because she had decided to do so and because she had seen a city that had nearly been hers alone and understood at last that nothing is ruled alone. The North will send bread when it has bread, she said, and men when it has men to spare, and keep its children warm whenever winter returns. If they call me queen, I will not ask them for more than that. If they do not, I will not ask them for less. She set her palm on the table. And when someone comes to try the walls again, I will come, if I am asked. If I am not asked, I will come anyway. Some fights are not borders. Jon stood between them and recognized that the distance was not so wide as men would like to make it. He had learned to be a bridge without collapsing entirely. That, he understood now with the clarity of a man who had been nearly burned by the fire of an old story, was his gift, if it was a gift and not a curse. We'll build the roads again, he said softly. We'll need them for trade, for food, for news. We'll need them for when the next time comes. What next time? someone asked. A young lord whose beard could not decide what sort of beard it wanted to be. The next thing that thinks we are separate, Jon said. He could see the boy did not understand. Maybe the boy's son would. Maybe that would be enough. Beyond the city, in places where the grass had grown back over old bones and the wind had stopped telling an old story of crows dining, small things began to grow again. A smith's apprentice set up his own anvil near a well that had been dug clean. A woman who had fled to White Harbor brought back a sprig of something the north grew better and pressed it into the soil beside her door. She sang to it out of habit and because she could not help herself. Elsie stayed in Winterfell longer than she had thought a person could stay anywhere. Her brother took a turn in the armory and learned to oil a blade so it would not rust, learned to take off a helm without tearing his ear. He learned to smile with a crooked tooth that he had been ashamed of in the city and was proud of in the yard because a boy from Deepwood Mott had one like it and laughed when he saw it. When the summer came, such as summers are in the north, they might go back. They might not. There were girls who plaited each other's hair in the shadow of the wall, and the plaits were a dialogue in themselves. There were boys who taught other boys to skate on the frozen ford by standing them on bones and pushing. Arya came home with a new scar that no one saw because someone had shown mercy, and she counted it against her as a debt she would someday pay. She kissed Sansa's cold cheek once in a moment no one witnessed and mocked Jon's beard with the same mouth, and her laughter returned to the hall the sound of wolf pups at play, which was a thing Winterfell had missed without having a word for missing. Daenerys went sometimes to the top of what remained of the Red Keep and stood where the wind could take her hair and tangle it until it hurt. She had Drogon fly low, small as a dragon can, children running beneath his shadow and reaching up their hands as if to touch a legend and finding instead hot air and the drag of an old fear gone gentle. She made decrees that had to do with bread more often than with blood, and when she could, she went to the places where the bread was and took a loaf and tore it herself and handed half to a woman and half to a man and kept none. It was not a trick. Tricks do not fill mouths. Tyrion kept his place by her side and sometimes by Jon's and sometimes by Sansa's, and he felt the old, familiar pull of being loyal to three things at once. He drank less and spoke more carefully and still too much. He found himself going to the new bells, someone had buffed them, and laying his palm against their cold sides as if he could coax them to a music that would tell the city it had done enough grieving for a while. He had never believed in vows that tired men swear on stones or in chapels, but he believed in the look on a child's face when she put her ear to a bell and listened for the sea trapped inside. He believed in that. Grey Worm learned to sit. That sounds small, and it was a thing with weight. He sat upon a bench on a step in a court where fishermen came to protest the price of cabbage and found that if he relaxed his hands upon his knees, men did not flinch when they passed. He did not forget Missandei. He did not want to. But the memory became something he could lay beside his spear instead of strapping it to his back before he could stand. He ordered a garden planted in a corner of the Unsullied's yard and did not know the names of any of the flowers that grew there and did not need to. He sat and watched bees go about their business and then went to his work and did it. Jon returned often to Winterfell because part of his heart had rooted there and because part of the realm's work could be done by him better there, the persuading, the listening. Sansa ruled the north with hands that learned how to hold harder than she had expected and softer than she had been taught. They argued sometimes with the old ease that siblings earn, with words that had edges and with affection dug in beneath. They did not strip each other of the armor they needed to wear for others. They found ways to unbuckle it a little when it was just them. One evening when the snow had come fine and thick and lay along the ramparts like lace, Jon found Elsie on the wall with Ghost beside her, both of them looking outward as if the north might do a trick if watched long enough. "You've a good friend," he said to her, meaning the wolf. She nodded. "He finds me when I should go inside," she said gravely. "That's a good friend," Jon agreed. She held up her whistle as if in explanation. "I only blow it when the ravens do a rude thing," she said. "What rude thing?" "They look into people." He bit back a smile. "They do." She looked up at him then with the directness of a child who had learned too much of courtly manners to be rude and too much of hunger to be anything but honest. "Why did you open the gates?" she asked. He considered the question as if it had never been asked of him before, and as if it had always been asked of him in one way or another. Because I remembered a night when the dead asked us all to be one thing. And we were, he said. It's hard to go back after you see that. It felt like closing a door on myself. She nodded, satisfied. She put her whistle away. The bells were loud, she said. Down there, in the city. They were. They didn't hurt my ears here. She touched Ghost's head. He makes a different noise. He does, Jon said, and the wolf huffed. He reached down and set his hand on Ghost's ruff, the fur coarse and warm. Snow gathered on the beast's nose and melted there, small miraculous things that disappear when you look at them too long. I think that's the noise I like better. On the last day of that winter's worst month, the bells in King's Landing rang for a wedding, an insignificant one by old measures, a fisher's daughter to a man who sold nails. The wind carried the sound farther than it should have. It did not reach Winterfell in any way that a human ear could swear to, but a raven on the gate cocked its head and listened, and a girl with a whistle glanced up without knowing why. In the Red Keep, a woman with silver in her braid paused with her hand over a map and smiled. In the council chamber, a queen in the north signed a decree that gave an old crooked man the right to cut timber along a stream where beavers had once lived and would again if someone sensible had anything to say about it. In a small yard where the weeds had been allowed their turn, a man with a spear lowered it and watched a bee land on a blue flower he had never seen before. Somewhere beyond sight, a dragon slept, which was a kind of mercy. What had been done could not be undone, but neither did it have to be done again in the same way. Roads that had been built to carry armies carried grain and gossip. The songs the bards sang did not know whose name to shout more loudly, and so learned verse about bridges and hearths and how bread smells when a city is saved. The world did not forget how to be cruel, but it remembered how to be otherwise too, and sometimes that was enough. The north kept its gates on hinges well-oiled and well-watched. Sansa stood from time to time at the wall with a cloak about her shoulders and thought of a girl who had once begged for lemon cakes and of the woman who counted loaves now with a steady hand and an eye that did not excuse. She loved her people with a fierceness that had no softness and tenderness that had no weakness. She had learned how to be both. She read letters in Tyrion's hand that could not help but be witty, and she replied with barbs that both of them pretended did not pierce. Jon traveled the King's Road as much as he had ever wanted not to, and he came to know the smell of every stretch of it. The part that ran along the shore where the salt found your throat, the part that climbed toward the neck where the earth itself decided to become something else, the bits that passed through villages where a dog barked and a woman came to her door to see who was making the dust. He slept under trees and in rooms that had seen too many men before him and learned to like both. When he dreamed, he sometimes saw the bells and sometimes heard wolves, and more often the two sounds did not contradict each other. Daenerys rebuilt the parts of the city that would be rebuilt and left some parts as they had fallen. A deliberate ruin that reminded men that stone is faithful and also breakable. She listened to men who knew the flow of sewer water and women who knew the flow of coin and children who knew where the light entered the alleys first thing in the morning. She sat the throne less than people thought a queen should and walked the markets more than they thought a queen would. She learned to accept the looks that were love and the looks that were fear and to seek out the ones that were respect because those lasted through winters. There were plots. There are always plots. Men who had lost too much power threw their dice again. Women who had not been asked anything in too long demanded to be asked and then answered in a manner no one had planned for. Tyrion foiled some and let some go long enough that they proved themselves foolish. Sometimes he failed. He drank with Jon once on a balcony that had survived by luck and said, "We prevented one kind of fire, the others are slower." Jon said, "We'll put them out with water and bread." And Tyrion laughed and did not disagree. The world outside the walls continued its own concerns. In the far north, up past the place where maps became invention, the snow thawed a week early and a stream that had been frozen since before men's fathers were born ran for 3 days and then froze again, having decided to give the future a taste. In the Reach, a woman discovered a way to keep grain from spoiling in a new kind of cask, and men praised her husband for it and then remembered and praised her too. On the Iron Islands, A boy looked out at a calm sea and felt bored and decided to learn carpentry. If there was a single moment anyone might point to and say, that is where it turned, it was not the bells. It was the hinge they hung upon. It was a gate in the north, opened in winter not to horse and banner but to people who needed to enter. The wood had groaned. The iron had protested. Men had set their shoulders against it and pushed, and the snow had squealed beneath their boots, and breath had smoked out from faces that had learned to be hard. That was all. That was enough. Elsie grew. Her brother learned to bend metal in the forge until it sang. She married no one until she was ready, and then married a boy who laughed when she told him a joke that made little sense and more joy. She had 2 children and named one for a woman who had held a cleaver and one for a wolf who had no. He judged. Sometimes, on evenings when the air had that peculiar clean smell that comes after snow, she took her old whistle down from the shelf and held it, not to blow it but to feel its worn place against her thumb where life had made a groove. John stood one night in the godswood with the snow falling as softly as it had when all of this had been impossible. He listened. He heard wind and the creak of heavy limbs and the small skitter of something that lived in the bark. He felt Sansa come up beside him without turning his head. "We were lucky," she said. "We were brave," he said, and then amended it because he had learned to be honest. Sometimes is better than never," she said. He reached up and let a flake melt in his palm and thought of a city where the bells were quiet because there were other sounds for once. The slap of laundry on a stone, the scrape of a broom, a child calling to a dog. He thought of a dragon dark against the sky and of a queen with her hand upon cold iron and of a man who had learned to sit and watch a flower. He thought of a raven cocking its head as if the snow carried the rumor of music. He thought of a gate on oiled hinges. "I'll take sometimes," he said, and the heart tree, which had seen too many nevers, watched him with eyes cut to look sad and thought, perhaps, that sometimes was very nearly a miracle.